The deadliest building fire in American history happened right here in Chicago. And there's a pretty good chance that you've never heard of it. This fire is the reason that doors in public places open out. It's the reason there are lighted exit signs and panic bars on emergency exit. It was 1903 at the Iroquois Theatre on the spot where the Oriental Theatre stands today. More than 600 people died, more than twice as many as in the Great Chicago Fire. Tomorrow morning, a long-forgotten plaque honoring the dead will be rededicated at City Hall. John Calloway told us about the Iroquois Theatre Fire several years ago. Here's another look at a tragedy that could have been avoided.
December 30th, 1903. A hint of snow fell on Chicago as a finely dressed crowd arrived at the Iroquois Theatre at Dearborn and Randolph. The theater had only been open a month. This was a Wednesday matinee performance of the Iroquois' first production, Mr. Bluebeard. The cold but excited theater goers had come from all over the Midwest. They came from 13 states and 86 cities and towns. Many had come downtown for a day of shopping and theater.
The audience that was there on this particular date was largely women and children because it was the holidays, break from school, and it was a matinee.
The Iroquois was the newest addition to a vibrant Chicago theater district centered on Randolph Street that included the Powers Theater, Central Music Hall, and the Garrick.
Chicago had hopes of overcoming New York and becoming the United States Center for theater. And the Iroquois was designed to be the equivalent of anything on the Broadway stage.
Marble staircases, elegant draperies, over 200 lamps in the main lobby alone. Really incredibly beautiful building.
But the Iroquois promised more than just an opulent setting for a show.
The architect of the theater, Benjamin Marshall, had said before the theater opened he had studied every theater disaster in history to avoid any problems at the Iroquois, and that in the event of fire, if all 30 exits were used, the place could be emptied within 5 minutes.
Of course, the Great Chicago Fire had just happened a little more than 30 years prior to that and was relatively fresh in people's minds, so the fire safety was an important element.
But in the fall of 1903, construction of the Iroquois was behind schedule for its November 23rd grand opening.
They were under a tight gun to get that theater open in time for the 1903 theater season. A lot of corners were cut, and building inspectors were paid off with free tickets to make sure that the theater opened on time.
When the Iroquois Theater opened, it was anything but fireproof. In fact, it was a fire trap.
It didn't have any fireproofing. It had no alarm box, no sprinkler system, no backstage telephone at a time when telephones were no longer a novelty in Chicago. It lacked all of the basics, and it did so because of the hurried nature with which it was constructed.
The first few weeks of Mr. Bluebeard were a huge success, and the December 30th matinee was no exception. The Iroquois' 1,600 seats were sold out, but more than 2,000 people watched the show.
People were packed in. They were standing 4 deep behind the last rows of seats in the gallery and the balcony. Some people had brought camp chairs and were parked in the aisles.
In addition to the overcrowding, some exit doors were bolted shut to keep out gate crashers.
And as a precaution to keep people in cheaper seats from gaining access to the more expensive seats during the performance, they put up accordion gates in some of the corridors.
So when the fire broke out toward the beginning of Act Two, people were trapped like rats inside this building.
Act 2 of Mr. Bluebeard began with a double octet, 8 couples singing the romantic ballad In the Pale Moonlight.
It's supposed to be occurring under moonlight. So most of the house lights are down, and there is a single lamp about 15 feet off the stage. Actually, it's this lamp right here that is focused on the actors on the stage with a blue glow. This lamp at some point sparks onto the curtains directly behind the stage.
The fire spread very rapidly up behind the proscenium arch. Young people, in particular children, sat and looked at this red glow above the proscenium arch, thinking it was one of the show's special effects. But then pieces of flaming canvas began to come down on stage, even as the double octet continued its performance.
Eddie Foy, who is the star of the show, emerges from his dressing room and comes to the stage and tries to calm the audience, make sure that everybody knows that the fire is under control, and he also encourages the orchestra, what remains of the orchestra, to continue playing to keep the audience from getting into a panic.
The house fireman, a fellow named Sallers, started shouting for the asbestos curtain to be lowered and for someone to pull the box, but there was no alarm box backstage.
By then, the audience knew that the fire was out of control, and they headed for the exits in a panic. But there were no exit signs. The architect found them distracting. Terrified patrons were blocked at every turn. Locked doors, accordion gates, and decorative doors that led nowhere.
The asbestos curtain finally started down, but then got jammed on a piece of lighting equipment just about the same moment that the escaping cast and crew forced open double scenery doors in the back of the stage, and this gush of cold air rushed in, mixed with the superheated air consuming the scenery loft, and burst under the curtain. It missed many people in the orchestra area, but swept up into the balcony and the gallery.
Survivors called it a giant ball of fire, and many in the balconies were killed instantly. Then the asbestos curtain burst into flames. It wasn't asbestos at all, but a less expensive fabric. Some patrons did find unlocked doors, but many of those were designed to open in, and the crush of the crowd made opening these doors impossible. Even some fire escapes were dead ends.
The highest fire escape had not been completed. In the rush by the construction company to get the theater open, they hadn't completed the stairway from the highest fire escape. Those people had nowhere to go.
Fire Engine Company 13 was just around the corner and got to the fire as quickly as they could.
But as you can imagine, with the crush of people coming out of the building, it's very difficult for the firefighters to do anything about the fire that's happening inside. So really the fire department's effort is really a recovery effort after the fact.
And the arriving firemen and policemen, and even some of the newsmen who were first on the scene who helped effect some of the rescues, were appalled and sickened at what they saw. And many men wept. They couldn't believe it. There were so many young children carried out of that theater that afternoon.
In the morning, papers listed the names of hundreds of victims. Most of the dead were women and children. Many burned to death in their seats. Others suffocated from the intense smoke and heat in the theater. And others, especially children, were trampled in the aisles and hallways. At the exits, firemen found bodies piled 10 high. The official death toll would reach 602, though the actual count is thought to be much higher. In the chaos at the theater and at the morgue, some people wrapped up the bodies of their children and brought them home.
Initially, lots of people received blame for this. The mayor, Carter Harrison, of course, the building commissioners, the building owners, and the building architects all received their share of blame. But in the long run, actually no one was ever jailed, no one was ever even fined.
You had complacency, you had hubris, you had greed. A lot of people knew about the problems and nobody did anything about it. Justice was not done in the case of the Iroquois Theatre.
The same cloud-heavy system that allowed the Iroquois to open in the first place kept anyone from being held responsible. Even though there was evidence that the building's design was poor and that it lacked adequate safety features, the architect, the owners, and others were found innocent because, as the judge put it, they weren't the ones who placed the light that burned the curtain.